Let's watch another CNN panel further discussing the healthcare CEO shooting that has the political world reeling as they've now caught a suspect thanks to a CEO-loving McDonald's employee. So I wanted to take possibly the last opportunity to run this story back and speak about some of the problems in the healthcare industry, but also in parallel to the acquittal of Daniel Penny as these two stories are now being compared.
The good guys today, Daniel Penny. The bad guys, Luigi Mangione. It seems to me.
How do you?
Everybody
what's
on the
the
left,
chart for victims?
I'm just telling you what I see out in the world.
I know.
What
I just want you to finish the
today,
chart. Which victim is good and which victim is bad.
What I'm telling you is
that's not on the second page.
People on the left. People on the left can't seem to tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys.
I'm not asking you about people on the left. I'm asking you whether you consider this person.
We had people praising Luigi.
I want to know whether you
Penny.
think that,
one is good,
as
one
Congressman Crane does, that Daniel Penny should get the Congressional Gold Medal to recognize his heroism. I'm not asking you about anyone else.
I think he ought to get medal. I think they ought to build a statue to this guy in New York City.
I think that race, and I'm going to say it. I'm going to say the dreaded R word. Race plays a role in this. Right? And so we see it. Yes, absolutely. Because statistics say that.
Wasn't there a similar case in New York City at the same time this one was going on?
That when people kill people who are white, they tend to get harsher sentences, especially if they're people of color.
There's a lot to speak on here that I want to get through without taking too much time. To start, Daniel Penny is the guy who choked out a homeless black man in the subway because the black man was acting belligerent and making threats, but hadn't aggressed on anyone. And it's hilarious to start how MAGA cried all year about judicial bias, how the legal system is biased and rigged and we can't trust any of their verdicts. Yet here they are as the party who would, before that, and still does, discount the idea that any just judicial discrimination could ever happen to black people. When it's black people, they always deserve it. Remember that. As if the real discrimination that happens is against white conservative billionaires. Like, what are we even doing? Like, the data is clear, and we'll get into the numbers on this in the second section, but it definitely plays a very huge factor. People value white life higher, whether subconsciously or not. It's part of the unconscious bias that still exists in America that still allows for systemic and systematic biases to spread and plague our culture, right? As you cycle through brown people even, you can see the different value levels placed, where Americans can shrug off Arabs being genocided, right? For black people, it's always, well, they probably deserved it, like, let's see the proof. But when a white person dies, the world needs to stop and finds out what happens. Through this, you can see the difference in the bias. It just kind of shows how the Republican perspective is and will always be wanting to protect power and punch down instead of up, because they're distraught at a billionaire CEO who denies claims of healthcare for profit being shot, and that the guy who did it is evil, and anyone cheering on this guy's death is despicable and abhorrent and all of this. But let's build a statue to praise a guy who choked out a random homeless black man who hadn't laid a hand on anyone. Like, let's still mock George Floyd to this day, but don't you dare act like we do when it's a billionaire being shot or you're despicable. Like, both of these individuals belong in jail. Both committed atrocious acts. The difference is, well, one, I can admit to this as the left, we don't just cheer on violence in the name of violence or in the name of punching down. And two, Luigi speaks to a larger issue that people can first resonate with and then discuss, and it sparks a very much needed conversation. It's like trying to say a woman comes back 20 years later and kills her dad because he sexually abused her as a child, versus a woman killing her dad because he wouldn't loan her money, right? Both are wrong. Both people committed murder, but neither are comparable here, and one sparks a larger conversation while the other doesn't.
Jordan, nearly all he had in his pocket was a muffin.
All right, listen, guys.
Well,
first of all, this is not a left-right issue. I'm on the left, and I actually think this was the right decision. Because the reason I think this is the right decision is because that's what the jury decided. And juries tend to get this stuff right. And that's what we have to believe in. There were multiple witnesses that were people of color. There were multiple people on the jury that were people of color. I think it's not really okay to call this a race issue. One of the guys who helped hold him down was a black man.
Okay, this is really bad for a Democratic strategist to be saying. I don't know who this lady is or care that she's on the left. I'm going to have to go into what she's saying here. But first, I do want to also point out, it's kind of funny that the Republican starts clapping like all passionately when she says she agrees, because he's like, haha, we got one. See, the Democrats even support choking out random black people. Like, then realizes that this is actually like an offhanded jab, because what she's saying is she believes in jury's decisions based off the preponderance of the evidence, and that is enough for her, which is something that will never be enough for MAGA. They will never do that when it is Trump that we're talking about. As my camera unfocuses, they will literally never do this when it is Trump. It's always the jury is biased. Oh, the evidence is fake, or there's not enough evidence, or who cares what the witnesses say, or the judge is biased. But notice how we get none of that here when it's a black person who was killed. It's the same state. It's New York, very liberal, where the liberal opinion on this is that it's wrong, it was murder, he should be charged, yet Penny was acquitted. But because it agrees with their worldview, they both won't critically engage with what that might mean, and they sure as hell won't say that it was rigged, which is kind of funny because, as the left points out, judicial bias is literally what played a part here, but the right won't have that conversation because we can only have it when it happens to a straight white conservative billionaire, of course. Even though what I'm talking about here, what the left is talking about in judicial bias, is something the data actually supports. I mean, we know from meta-analysis of all studies on the matter, I believe it was 28 studies at the time, that 82% of the time juries, yes, even when jurors of the same race were included, would sentence harsher those who murdered a white victim. We also know that juries, yes, even when jurors of the same race are included, sentence black people to longer sentences for the same crime with the same criminal backgrounds. Like, two people, if you take a black person and a white person, never committed any crimes before, and then they committed the same crime in the same context, the black person was sentenced longer. They did these through mock trials. They did these through analyzing real trials. Like, this is a consistent, objective, factual point that is seen in data. So clearly, these biases do exist on the basis of race. They're, again, seen in the data, and they often bear out in the rulings, to the extent that even in liberal demographics, the ruling goes against the liberal position, which, again, should just give the game away, but it's really all just false framing anyway by the right, that this idea that politics plays this huge role in decisions made in the courtrooms, it was crafted by MAGA to defend Trump, because the preponderance of evidence wasn't something they could argue. It's not something that is true at all. And rulings like this, again, show that. I mean, you can also look at some of the more infamous acquittals of all time. And a lot of the time, it's things or people that liberals loathe and don't agree with, yet they're acquitted in liberal areas. But when Trump is found guilty in a liberal area, that has to, it literally just makes no sense. But we can't have this conversation about judicial bias because MAGA only wants to hear it when it's a Republican being held accountable. They don't actually care about judicial bias. It's only a conversation they're willing to have when a Republican is in court, and then they're only willing to have it in the context of conservatives or victims. They're never going to give away like black people are the actual victims of judicial bias. So now we then get the right cheering on one murder while simultaneously pretending the other side is crazy for the saying a CEO probably brought it on himself. Like, this double standard is never been more prevalent probably than right now.